Welcome. My name is Peter Fever, and I'm the director of the Duke program in American Grant Strategy. And I want to welcome you to our first ever LDOC event. LDOC, for my guests, is last day of classes. It's an almost, it's a profane holiday. Now I was going to say a sacred holiday, profane holiday at Duke. Students believe that you're not allowed to assign any work on the last day of class. You're just supposed to spend the time doing crazy things on your last day of classes at Duke. Usually by this point, students definitely don't want to see a professor at around 1:30 on LDOC. That's the last thing they want to see. But because we're all separate, no one's on campus and everyone is being responsible and it's 5 o'clock everywhere always, we're gonna do this event now. And I can't think of a better trio of folks to tell us how to navigate our way through this crazy national security marketplace. These are three of the most successful people in the business. They've had extensive careers in government, but also now outside government, running important programs. They hire people, and they are looking for people over the last several years and into the future. They'll be hiring people so they can give us good advice. And they're also good friends of the program. Kath, Kori, and Kelly, thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure, Peter.
So we'll unmute you guys so that we can go around the horn. And we'll begin, why don't we begin with you, Kath Hicks. You, and just by brief intro, you have had a career both in DOD and as a SES, Senior Executive Service, but also as a political appointee and at a very senior level. But now you run the distinguished program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. So tell us, what does the marketplace look like from CSIS's vantage point? And let's unmute your mic so you can join us. Great.
Thanks very much, Peter, and happy to be here. And Kori was saying, just as we switched over, that I have great branding because I have the CSIS logo, but I have to admit I'm required to have this CSIS logo. So if anybody reports back on me, I have fulfilled my institutional obligation. So really great to be with you all. Congratulations on reaching the last day of class, even in an incredibly unusual year. I can't imagine how strange it must be, particularly for the seniors or those who are finishing their master's program this year. And given all that, I think it was prescient for Peter to pull this panel together. What I can tell you from my vantage point at CSIS, first of all, we historically hire a lot of interns. We also hire a pretty sizable cadre of entry-level folks at the research assistant or program coordinator level. Those are actually two slightly different positions. And so I know that we are one of those resources people are looking to, along with Kori and Kelly and their organizations and others. The pieces I think that are most important to keep in mind right now from the perspective of a think tank like CSIS is that the areas where there are the biggest hurdles are where there is the funding uncertainty that is specific to a project or a program, and I'll talk about what this means. And where virtual work arrangements are particularly problematic. So let me just talk briefly about those two, and then I'm going to talk about what I think you can do, and I do think there's a lot you can do right now. Uncertain funding streams. So let me take a contrast between US government funded projects and for instance, and then something that's funded by a major foundation. So like the Carnegie Foundation or something, Carnegie Corporation, excuse me. So on the US government side, we're already well into the fiscal year for them. They have their funds obligated. The bills have been passed that have authorized and appropriated that money. And so where they are putting out research work, where they're putting out broad area announcements, anything like that, that money has to get obligated. So there's much more funding certainty around projects or programs that get a lot of their funding that way. By contrast, if you're working with a foundation, this is a tough time for them to start major new efforts. Now, they are always very good about protecting enduring relationships that they have with programs and scholars. So if someone's worked with one of these foundations, a MacArthur, a Carnegie, a Ford, whatever it is, a SCAFE foundation for a long period of time, those people are going to be prioritized, and those foundations are going to look out for those folks. So someone who's 5 years into a long relationship with the foundation probably is going to be okay, even if there's a funding delay. They'll feel like they can hire. But if it's a new start for a corporation, they might actually delay until there's more certainty in the environment. So big new efforts might in fact be delayed. Let me briefly touch on the virtual issue. Much of the work that a think tank does can be done virtually quite well. We're probably among the places that are particularly well suited. We may be in the tech sector, particularly well suited for virtual work. The convening power, however, that piece of our work that's about bringing people into close community for closed door events, or drawing major speakers into a room where we have to have people who are helping us staff that has shifted. It obviously continues, events like this go on, but it's shifted the work requirements. And so those people who are research assistants, who fall more into that first category, they're pretty well occupied, if not swamped. And then the people who do more that program coordinator job, which has more to do with event management, things like that, there are some areas there where I think the hiring will be slower. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about what I think folks can be doing.
Hold on, Kath. Let me go around the horn with
sure,
Kelly and Kori on the sit rep, and then we'll do the what to do about it. So Kelly, you've had a career both in the White House and DoD, and right, and so you see government from and state. That's right. I forgot about you. Started out at state, but so you've seen across the government. But you are now at the Center for American Progress, which is sort of a left-leaning institution, but focusing in on national security issues. What's the situation look like from your vantage point?
Yeah, I would agree largely with what Kath laid out. I think essentially, we haven't necessarily stopped hiring per se, but we're delaying sort of non-essential hires at the moment, just because the fact that you have to process people is a lot more difficult in this environment. But we're certainly not taking our foot off the gas, for example, on existing grants or areas that we're trying to fill with, really smart people, including Duke students. But it's just sort of like depends on the position. It depends on the grant that we're doing. And I think Kath's point about funding uncertainty, I think that is impacting a number of think tanks and organizations across the DC space. Our institution doesn't take U.S. government funding, so we don't have that predictable funding stream, for example. And so we really rely heavily on foundation funding. We don't even take really corporate money. We take it in very small doses. So we've got a lot of open questions about where foundations are headed in terms of areas of focus. Now, I would say that's both going to be a challenge, but potentially a huge opportunity as well, especially for folks who are studying national security and foreign policy, like yourselves, because I do think, the last major structural shift like this was really post 9/11. When the federal government went on a huge hiring spree in terms of trying to fill people who had expertise on certain areas, hire more foreign service officers, for example. And so thinking about global pandemic is potentially an opportunity as well about shifting areas of focus on national security and kind of casting a bit of a wider net around it. If you're looking at federal, potentially going to work for the US government. So not just looking at the State Department or DoD as a traditional place to seek employment, but actually looking at broader places like commerce, and Treasury Department, and thinking through global supply chains as an example, and what that will mean for national security, technology. So I do think that there's also a potential major strategic moment for students who are studying these areas to actually get a bit of a leg up, especially if you're like a rising senior or a junior or whatnot, or going into graduate work. This is a place where you can actually kind of expand kind of what you're working on to maybe fit a new major international and national moment. But I agree on the think tank side right now, we're kind of in a holding pattern, but trying to think through like how we would shift our research towards this new kind of challenge. And so there could be opportunities that come along down the pike. So I would agree that right now everyone's we're all in this together. We're all experiencing this together. Everyone's having the same kinds of days. And well, for most of us who are privileged enough to be in these positions, but it's, I think that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I'd like to say maybe not in the immediate sense of like the next 6 weeks, but certainly maybe over the next year or so in terms of where foreign policy and national security expertise may be valued in different ways than it was before.
And Kori, let me bring you in. You started in the Joint Staff, then went to the White House and ended up as Deputy Policy Planning Director at State. So you crossed the government as well. You're now running the Foreign Policy National Security component of AEI, which is a right-leaning institution. But recently you helped run IISS, which is based in London, international one. So can you speak what the situation looks like both at AEI, but also to the extent that you know it, foreign institutions in other countries like London or Europe, European-based ones? Yeah.
So I'll start with AEI. We don't take government money and we don't take foreign money. And so we aren't beholden to some of the usual suspects, but we are more beholden to plutocrats than other think tanks are. So we tend to have a relatively small group of large funders who for the moment have a lot of confidence in their willingness to continue to fund the organization and our ability to continue to run it, even if we have large economic shocks. We have the advantage of having one of the most prominent, sensible voices on public health policy, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, and all of us in the national security space are just coming into his drag wake and letting ourselves be pulled along. We have in the Foreign and Defense Policy Program, we have about 40 scholars, about 20 research assistants, most of whom are post-master's degree work in one or another area of national security studies. We take about 30 interns overall at the institution in the summer. We take about 12 of them into the Foreign and Defense Policy Program, and we have already taken this summer's cohort. It's going to be a strange summer though, because our building is closed and we're likely to keep it closed through at least June, and have reduced access for people to the building since then. And that creates, I think, two problems that I would be really worried about if I were coming into the national security field. The first is that it's going to privilege people who have existing relationships with institutions. So it's going to reinforce privilege and social capital in a way that will make it harder for people who have non-traditional paths to get their foot in the door for opportunities. And the second way, I think I'm scared for people coming into the field. But as Kelly Magsamen rightly said, it's also a huge opportunity, which is that in my judgment, there's going to be sustained downward pressure on defense spending and spending in the traditional national security space. We're going to see an expansion of the definition of national security, right? People are going to be a lot more worried about health policy and supply chains. But that means for people who are still in an educational pipeline, this reinforces even more than previously the the ability to tailor your studies to give you a stronger foundation in languages, in economics, in health policy. The great advice I got when I was a summer intern in the State Department from Ambassador Roz Ridgway, who was the Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs, was that you should always have a functional and a geographic expertise. I don't think those necessarily need to be the two categories, but having two different areas of expertise so you can hopscotch to where opportunities show up, I think is even more important than ever. The last thing I will say in terms of advice to folks coming into the field is that the summer that I came into the field in the mid-1980s was the summer of the Pollard spy case, where the Israeli government had turned an American intelligence officer into an Israeli agent. When Pollard was caught, they shut down all of the national security internships in the American government and every possible way to get even a low-level clearance. And I could not get a job that summer, although I had spiffy credentials and lots of good people willing to recommend me. I spent that summer reading and having coffee with people who I wanted to interview for jobs with, but didn't have any job to give me. And it made for a really discouraging summer. But for at least 5 years after that, those people circled back with me when they had jobs to offer. And so I would encourage students not to think just short term. And if you don't get the opportunity for paid employment, find another way to support yourself, do volunteer work in the areas that you're interested in, and by all means, write. There's never been an easier time to publish your ideas, and that's the best way to create a foundation that's going to make you more competitive than your peers.
So great. Let me circle back now to you, whoever's sitting in front of this SCSIS logo. That's all I can see. Oh, it's you, Kath, there. What would you add? You were starting to list some recommendations, and we've heard some more. So amplify on that list, if you would, please. Kath, yes. Oh, you got to unmute you. Okay, there you go. You can't unmute yourself? There we go.
No, the host has been muting me, which I understand. I get that. Let's see. So yeah, I'd pick up right where Kori left off. I mean, I think the very top thing I would mention is the ability to leverage how open it is to write, to podcast, to host. I mean, the barriers to entry for virtual events, obviously much easier to sort of demonstrate ways in which you are engaging in the field. That's never something we expect of junior staff. We don't look at resumes and say, oh, that person, they didn't cure cancer, or they didn't have a Middle East peace program, podcast. But I will say it is a differentiator. So when we see those resumes come in and people are going out of their way at night, at weekend, whatever, that's huge. And I have to say the vast majority of the things we look for, really you could work at Starbucks. It really, honestly, what we are looking for is, are you reliable? Are you professional? Are you a good teammate? Can you communicate? All those things that you can demonstrate in lots of different ways. And then this extra piece, I think, about, do you have a passion for the field? And I would echo some of the things that have come up in terms of agility, demonstrating that, you have certain areas that really interest you. There's no reason to not, you shouldn't hide that. That displays that you can follow something at depth. But also that willingness to kind of go beyond that, because the opportunities, as the spigot, if you will, comes back on, in some ways you're going to benefit. As strange as that sounds, you're going to benefit from that. People have been pausing their hiring for a bit, and at some point here, like Kelly said, we are still open for business. We're still doing hires. But I think as you move closer to fall, that's going to, people are still kind of delaying because it's hard to do the interview process virtually. So some of that's going to turn back on, and you're going to actually benefit from that. I would add, I think anything with a tech angle, you're in pretty good shape. There are lots of opportunities at the intersection of national security and tech. I actually sometimes hire engineers and teach them policy, but I also hire policy people and get them to learn tech. So, you know, that's a really promising space that applies, and health policy, defense policy, diplomacy of the future, it doesn't matter if you can kind of make sure that you're thinking about how you can demonstrate. Obviously, when you're a digital native, it's a lot easier. You demonstrate it through just the generational shifts, so that's important. And then the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the political side. It is an election year. I very much hope we broaden our sense of what national security means, but I don't think that's a foregone conclusion in the next 6 months. So whatever your politics and whatever you think about what national security means, there is a rhythm to election years and what they mean in the national security sector. It's a minority of people who sort of get their launch through that political pathway, and none of the three people here talking to you are people who started that way. We all started in sort of the you know, in the deep state somewhere. So I think to the extent that you want to get involved, that's a pathway that some people have been able to use to get into the national security community. If that is of interest to you, I encourage you to be focused more on get out the vote kind of jobs, things that can be done easily virtually, being on a phone bank, things like that. Writing, you know, the national security policy for the Biden or Trump campaigns is not going to happen, nor is it going to help you get a job. What's going to help is if you're out there in the field offices, same at the congressional level, even your current incumbent member of Congress working through their local office, things like that. Those are the things that actually can help you in an election year differentiate yourself.
I was just talking to Colin Call and Jake Sullivan. I'll tell them that they're in the wrong place. They should be doing the phone bank.
Yeah, they probably should be doing the phone bank, but they are obviously at a different level. Yes.
Yeah, fair enough. So Kelly, I wanted to go to you and ask you to add anything you wanted to add, but also specifically answer the following two questions. You know, what is Kath was saying, or I think both Kath and Kori were saying, anything is better than nothing. So it doesn't have to be in the national security think tank world. And so speak to that. Many of my students are anxious. They feel like you have to have the think tank internship, you have to have the Senate internship, and that there's a very prescribed path. So speak to that. The second question, for those who are more on one side or the other of a political divide, do you look, if you saw someone had an AEI internship, does that hurt them applying to CAP? And of course, I'm going to ask you the inverse question in a moment, Kori. But Kelly, take it away.
Sure. I'm happy to answer those. I also just sort of want to build on a little bit of what Kath said on the political side. Kap's a little bit more politically engaged in this space. So I agree with Kath. If there's a way for you during this period to make good use of yourself, if you're interested in that kind of thing, and demonstrate, you know, skills around that. So whether it's organizing, you know, coordinating, things like that, that you can put on your resume, those are actually very attractive, especially to like an organization like mine. We're a progressive organization, but we do have a C4, a political action arm. So we look for skill sets like that because we do actually get involved in some of those things. I'd also just say, you know, this is an interesting period. I mean, this is obviously a challenging period, but I would also kind of use this as a moment to have your own kind of apprenticeship or your own period of professional development until, you know, the hiring spigots really turn back on. I mean, that can be like to what Kori said and what Kath said, you know, writing, publishing, researching, demonstrating that skill. It could be taking, you know, there's virtual learning classes that you can take. There's virtual language classes you can take. So this is an interesting time to actually use to your advantage. Because one thing I'll be looking at in terms of looking through resumes for job applications is looking for people who didn't just sit there during this period of time and wait, but they use this time to actually actively professionally develop themselves. So that's something that I will definitely be asking in interviews. I'll be looking for in resumes. I think there's a number of ways that you can actually do that. And there's just, I know I was doing some research last night about, there's so many different e-learning courses that you can take on management, on all sorts of things. that are useful to include in your resumes. And you, Peter, you asked me, what was your question again?
Well, the defined path versus
Oh, yeah.
You've already answered that, but then also the left-right.
Yeah, so I think, so actually it's really funny. I have hired somebody who was an AEI intern before. So it isn't necessarily a knock to being hired at CAP. Of course, we're a progressive organization, and anyone we hire, we want to make sure that they share in the common values of the mission of the institution, and which is like key, but we never really get into like whether you're a Republican or Democrat. That would be not great. But certainly in terms of sharing the values and things like that. But on the straight path, this is one thing I talk about a lot in regular career mentoring sessions, is there is no straight line to your destiny. And it feels like you have to have the perfect resume and the perfect job to lead to the next perfect job, to lead to the next perfect job. And I will tell you that in perfect circumstances, there is no perfect job. Okay. And so I think just being patient with yourself and giving yourself a wider range of options, and not being too stressed about whether or not it's going to take you off course from your predetermined decision to be the national security advisor, which of course we've all pre-decided here on this call, especially Peter, I believe. It's his number one life objective. So, my career has taken me in so many different places. I started at the State Department and federal government. I ended up going to the NSC, was there for like 6 years under 2 different presidents. Never thought I would stay that long. Then ended up at DoD. I never thought I was going to be at DoD. And by the way, doing Asia policy, I was a Middle East policy person for most of my career. And suddenly now I'm doing Asia policy at the Pentagon. That was a total shift. So there's not necessarily any straight path that you can totally plan for. But what you can do, and what's within your control, is how you think about the skills you want to have for the jobs you want to pursue. And that's where I think using this time wisely, and frankly, getting involved at the local level. I mean, if anything has been proven in this crisis, it's that like local matters, right? You see the power that governors have, that mayors have in terms of people's lives, and being engaged in that space right now, I think is hugely valuable. Even if it's not national security specific, because another thing that I look for is like just general public service, people who want to serve their communities, who want to be engaged, and who want to try to make better lives for their fellow citizens. So I would encourage you to use this time in that regard.
So, I need to clarify, as Kori knows, my ambition is to be Deputy National Security Advisor under Kori as National Security Advisor. So
that would be a smart decision.
Kori, what would you add here, but also about the left-right, our students tracked at an early stage and can't, get stuck, in other words, in one furrow or another?
Yeah, I don't think students, unless you've been the chairman of the Duke Republican Students Association, most people don't expect entrance into the policy field to be making major political statements. So we don't ask about it. We don't look for it. We look for the same kinds of things Kelly and Kath were talking about, which is somebody who cares about big problems, somebody who has a demonstrated get up and go, somebody who has prepared for an interview by Google stalking the person that they're interviewing with and reading everything that person's written and coming into the interview with a view on that and a willingness to argue where you think they're wrong, right? Because all 4 of our institutions, of course, to include Peter and Duke, we're in the ideas industry. We care about people who think about things and bring data-soaked arguments to the problem. So that's what we are looking for. I think Kelly's advice was outstanding about the number of ways to upskill yourselves in this particular time. I would emphasize even more than Kelly did, though, that there's no straight path. this is going to be a really rocky couple of years in the American economy. So apply for one of those splashy small business loans and start a business you see an opportunity for. Ship out in the Marine Corps. I mean, go do something that's going to give you life experience that will train your judgment. Two things to point out about that. The first is that I went to work in Colin Powell's Joint Staff when I was a 26-year-old PhD student, and I was a science project because everybody around me had professional experience that trained their judgment. And the reason they took me in was to see whether you could teach any dog to talk, right? Because to see if by explaining to me why they made decisions the way they made them, they could train my judgment. So it wasn't a natural direction for me to work in. My scholarship, such as it was at that time, had been on economic development in Latin America. So grab opportunities, because most people's careers aren't directed lines. They're snatching and serendipitous occasions. And my own, I always laugh when people think that, I made a shrewd set of strategic choices that propelled me from one opportunity to the next. Because what my career looks like to me is a series of shipwrecks where I gasp in the cold, salty water and try and tread until a passing ship picks me up and I can get seaworthy again. So don't worry about the failures. They won't define you unless you let them define you. And it's never been easier to be the curator of your own professional experience. Credentialing matters a lot less than it used to. Remember how conservatives used to roll their eyes at President Obama talking about be the change you want to be in the world? Honest to God, the parallel now is create the profession you want to have in the world.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to footstop one of your things you said about Google stalking. So I linked up one of our students, I won't say who, with a senior friend of all three of ours all four of us in the business. And he's famous for his irascible personality. His first question was, have you read everything I've written on this subject? To which the student said no. So he hung up and called me up and chewed me out for why did I say that? And I tried to explain to students, all three of you are so busy, you get so many requests, you only have time to provide the margin beyond what was learnable if they had just read your stuff, which is all widely available. So I tell my students, do the research before they take your time, but not always.
It's amazing how few people do it though. I mean, just yesterday, I was interviewing somebody applying for the vice president of communications of AEI. And I asked her, what are we doing well and what are we doing poorly? And she actually took my breath away by saying, well, I haven't actually had time to look into that. and we were done right there.
So I have a question about extracurriculars and co-curriculars. So do they matter? Extracurriculars, which are sort of the fun stuff that students might do, and co-curriculars like an AGS program, like what we're doing right now. How valuable are those when you're building your personal human capital? Who wants to go first? Kath, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, sure. I think they're valuable, and it will depend on what the activity is to some extent. So let's kind of start with, dedication through leadership on a team, fraternities, things like that, sororities. It all kind of depends on what you're able to demonstrate in an interview. You
Pledge master in fraternity is not something you put. Sorry? Pledge master in the fraternity, not.
I would strongly discourage that being included on a resume. Yeah, curate your social media and your resume appropriately. Yeah. So, but then to this issue, like AGS is a great example. I'll go back to what I said before about this demonstration of passion about the issue set, and the issue set, I think, is really shapeable to the interview. So it could be the same set of things that interest you, but you might, in the conversation, depending on what the position is, you might turn it 5 degrees this way or 5 degrees that way. And I think there's a way to represent how you participated through something like AGS to show you began that pathway because you were really interested, for instance, in US foreign policy and strategy. You stayed in it because you found particular networks or leaders that you wanted to meet with and connect with, and you really resonated with their work, or you followed this pathway or pathways of different inquiry, and then maybe you produced X or Y. I think those are all, again, incredibly valuable, more so than sort of the whether you specifically had a job, if you will, in this world before.
Good. Kelly, anything to add?
No, I think that's right. And just to put a plug in for the wonderful AGS effort, it does, demonstrate, to Kath's point, a level of passion, but it also demonstrates some rigor. And something that I look for a lot in talent is people who have really put themselves into a challenging program, something that stretches them beyond their core studies. And that's sort of just additional, edge to it. And I think it's really important in my mind to be able to look at a resume or see somebody who's had that kind of rigorous program experience. It's important to me, at least.
I want to go to you, Kori, and then I'm going to take a question from the audience. So, Kori.
I just absolutely agree with both of those points.
Okay. Let me ask Bo Carlson then, who's on us to Melanie will unmute Bo, and Bo, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have a question for Kori Schake. A few years ago, you came to Duke, and we had a lunch, and you talked a bit about the Foreign Service and how bad it was often at allocating human capital. So I wonder how coronavirus will change the Foreign Service in the future, if it's a time to start looking at that again.
Oh, I love that question. And by the way, you have just modeled the fabulous behavior that we've been talking about, right? Demonstrated expertise on a subject, demonstrated knowledge about the person that you're talking to, and asked an interesting question. So thank you for being Exhibit A on how to do this right. As I recollect what I said about the Foreign Service, it was that, yes, it's terrible, and go join it and fix it. And I think that is even more true now because there have been a lot of Foreign Service officers who left the service during the tenure of the Trump administration, which means lots more upward mobility than is usually possible in an organization. Second thing is that the Trump administration's America First strategy has, in my judgment, unquestionably made our outcomes worse in the pandemic by not participating in international institutions that provide for strategic depth and the ability to see problems manifest themselves early, but also by being narrowly transactional. And I think you're going to see a pendular swing if the president is not reelected. And that will mean lots of opportunities for fresh thinking about how America engages the world. And that's a really exciting time to be part of an institution. Even at its entry levels, it's a really dynamic time. And so that could make it a lot of fun. The other thing is, if the president is reelected, it will be a hugely honorable undertaking to protect the institutions of American governance, of which the State Department is a very proud and proper one. And so coloring inside the lines, behaving with personal integrity, and not exceeding the legal authority of the institution is actually really going to matter to the country. So in either direction that politics takes us, I think it's a wonderful time to contribute to America's engagement with the world.
And Kath, I want you in a second to talk about DoD, how DoD hiring, to the extent you know about it. But let me also just mention that the intelligence community is continuing to hire. That may actually be the one where the most jobs are. And I'm very pleased to announce that we have Andrew Vail with us. He's a senior DNI rep who's the on-campus Duke rep who just joined us like a couple weeks ago, and he'll be here next year. So, and then Sue Gordon, the former deputy DNI, is joining us.
Oh, such a great catch!
Right. So we've got like DNI South here that we're building at Duke.
That's awesome.
But so for any students interested in a career in intelligence, it's a different path, and you should really speak to Andrew and Sue about that. And you can email Melanie, and she can link you up with either or both of them. But Kath, what about DoD, the other 800-pound gorilla in hiring?
Yeah, well, let me just say one thing at the front end, which is to echo what you heard from the other two speakers, that there will be pressure on DoD top line, no doubt. It would have happened anyway, and COVID will only continue that. But I think that's separate from this question a little bit on the hiring piece of it. There is significant authority that hasn't been used on civilian hiring, and there's broad bipartisan Senate support, for instance, to back that being fulfilled. And part of that is actually a civ-mil issue,
Right.
because even the Senate Republicans are concerned that there's not enough civilian oversight as people are leaving and as positions aren't getting filled, et cetera. So I think at a minimum, there will be a lot of pressure to actually put appropriations against those positions that Congress has already added. And so there are things like the John McCain Fellow Program that has not, DoD just hasn't done it, even though it's been authorized and appropriated. So there'll be areas like that where in this cycle of the National Defense Authorization Act, I expect we'll see some legislation to force DoD to move into some of these areas. And then on top of that, DoD hiring, I don't think there'll be a ton of direct DoD hiring. There's going to be always some. So the things I would be thinking about in addition to trying to pursue that pathway, if you're interested in defense, is definitely the contract base. DoD definitely hires directly out of folks who are coming from the contract community. And that's probably a whole side conversation, so I won't get into depth on who I mean by that. But almost no matter what you want to work on, there's a contractor helping DoD work on that problem. So that can be a good existence in and of itself, and it can also be a springboard into a full-time civil service position in DoD. Obviously, people should be thinking about, Kori already mentioned the Marines, but you might be thinking about the reserves or even about accessions, if you will, directly into the military. There definitely is hiring going on there, and there's some recruiting challenges that make this actually a pretty good time to try to go in. But even if it's just the reserve piece of it, I think that's a huge leg up in terms of how you understand the community. Obviously, the public service piece and your legitimacy as a scholar in areas of defense can be helped by some amount of understanding that's experiential, I'll just say. So those are the big things I think I would highlight. I would just say, once again, a lot of people focus on the political route. It's a tiny, 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 tiny soda straw. So for going into DoD, I don't think that's where I would focus my attention. Although, of course, if that's where your passion is right now, absolutely pursue that. It's just, it's not likely to be the major reason you end up in a job in DoD.
Great. Let me go to Raul. Raul, you're next.
Peter, can I, before that, can I just add one quick point?
Sure.
Every federal job gives a veteran's preference.
Yes.
So not only do you get experience on these issues, but you get preferential hiring for federal positions if you've done military service.
Great. Raul.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is a question for all three of you. And I think it's something you all three of you touched on a little bit earlier, but I thought I'd push a little bit harder. If you're looking for full-time employment or for an internship, either one, and let's say that your experiences don't necessarily match the policy experience required. So let's say most of your experience is in state government, but you're interested in international development or foreign policy. How would you differentiate yourself in an interview or on an application, as opposed to candidates who might have had those experiences?
Oh, I'll take a swing at that one. Most states have major trade policy delegations that go, I mean, the great golden state of California, my native land, practically has an independent foreign policy. And so if you have worked in state government, if I were interviewing and I had been, doing a job in state government, I would make the case that states have a lot of latitude and actually a lot less supervision in how they conduct those kind of policies. They don't have to be consistent with the overall federal policy. I would also say that that globalization has edged away at some of the authority and exclusivity, some of the monopoly on foreign policy and trade policy that governments used to have. And so state government, the ability to figure out how to work states into alignment with the federal government is a hugely important skill set. And I would use two examples if I were you. The first is that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced a few months ago that the first country that's going to meet its Paris Climate Accord commitments is the United States of America. Despite withdrawing from the accords, despite the overt hostility of the Trump administration, despite a major deregulation push by the Trump administration, the golden state of California, sanctimonious Tim Cook of Apple, the great city of Chicago, are all pulling us towards doing something without federal government support. And maybe that's the wave of the future. And the second one that I would add is look at the genius the government of Canada has in working with American states to get states to lobby the federal government towards policies that Canada wants. Whether it is keeping open the supply bridge to Detroit or not deploying American troops along the Canadian border, that there are lots of ways in the American government to hit bank shots, and somebody knowledgeable about the state, how states do that, is actually very well qualified. I think that's a positive distinction you can make.
I'd just like to point out that here at AGS, we refer to him as Duke Board of Trustee member Tim Cook, not sanctimonious.
Same thing.
So I got Phil Ma as our last question from the audience. Phil.
So thank you all for your insights today. I know that all of you either have a master's and or a PhD. So I was wondering whether you could give some insights on whether now is a good time to go into grad school. I know after talking to Dr. Fever that he thinks it's better to have more experience, and a lot of people do, to have more experience out of bachelor's and then go into grad school. So when do you guys think is the right time to get a master's or a PhD? And when do you think getting a PhD is superior use of your time than a master's?
And let me just add a footnote, because when Phil and I talked, it was pre-COVID. So I was giving him sort of the normal advice, take some time off. But if you look out and say there are no jobs, is now a time to invest in human capital by getting the master's degree, just because that's where you can ride out a bad job market. So who wants to go? Kelly, why don't you go first, and then we'll go Kath, and then.
Sure, I'll speak to this as the only person on the screen so far that does not have a PhD, and did did okay, I think.
Yeah.
So I would actually, in a normal environment, I would totally agree with Dr. Fever, and say that I would always encourage folks to get some life experience and some professional experience before going into graduate school. I personally had 5 years of working experience before I was entering grad school relatively late in my life. And I think on the PhD side, I'll defer obviously to Kori and Kath and Peter. I was in government, working in government. I was, doing the things I wanted to be doing. Didn't necessarily, see the need for a PhD in terms of like practicing what I was doing. I was never really that interested in, being an academic and teaching, which I think you really have to have some sort of core interest in that in many cases to really want to pursue a PhD. I wouldn't recommend you do so unless you have an interest in that, because it's from a policy perspective, it's not necessarily a must-have to be successful in the national security space. But from a, if you want to be able to teach, like when I left the government and I was looking for jobs, I couldn't go teach at Duke because I didn't have a PhD. It is actually a useful thing to have, but that's really if you're really focused on teaching. But now in the current state of COVID, I don't really know that there's a perfect advice to give here. I would say, yes, I would take a hard look at maybe a graduate program. But I will also say that I went to Johns Hopkins for my graduate degree, and I talked to a number of SAIS current master's students right now who are having, similar challenges with just having virtual education right now. So depending also how long this goes, is probably going to be a factor in that. And because, getting a graduate degree is not cheap and you want to use it to maximum effect. And it's hard. I mean, it's just harder in a virtual environment. And so I think there's a lot of frustrations there, but in general, I would say definitely try to get some life professional experience, because it will change what you want to do. It could potentially change you and put you on a different course. You might decide, you know what, I really don't want to be doing X, Y, or Z or studying X, Y, or Z.
Dr. Hicks, is there any value in a PhD?
Well, let me first say on the master's issue, I think Kelly summarized that well. I think it would be honest to tell you that if you are pretty sure you're going to work in DC in the national security sector, probably any public policy sector, it is a credential issue. And it does not matter that much, sorry to say, where you go. But having that degree does become important for salary levels and for setting a basic standard. PhD, totally different. There is no real community in Washington in which you really need to have that PhD from a credentialing perspective. If you're successful on the practitioner side, it certainly substitutes for what most things would require for a PhD. So, even if you wanted to be the dean of a school someday, sometimes that isn't even an issue. So why do people go get PhDs? Is there value in it? I found it hugely helpful and valuable to me. I absolutely do not encourage it for the general public. I often tell people only kind of facetiously that you sort of had to be dropped on your head as a kid to have this desire, but you really have to have that absolute conviction that this is something you need to do for you if you're going to be a practitioner. Obviously, if you want to end up in the academic world, that credentialing is hugely important in all ways: where you go, what you study, who you study with, etc. But I will tell you, I use my learning at the master's level and at the doctorate level. I use that routinely. I enjoy the parts of my job that are related to having a PhD. I enjoy sitting on dissertation committees. I enjoy having exchanges with folks about their work, etc. So in that sense, I probably sit a little more in the gap between practitioner and academic than just being squarely a practitioner. So I find it useful.
Kori, anything to add quickly before we have to close?
Yes, I agree with Kelly and with Kath. I think smart people stay in school longer than they ought to. And being risk averse in your 20s will lower the slope of the line of your career trajectory. Now is the time to take risks, not the time to make safe bets. And you can always go to school if you need to. But I think most smart young people stay in school because they know they're good at it. And in scary times, they reinforce that. That's what I did, and I wish I had made a different choice. On the PhD, it prepares you super well to be a scholar. It also prepares you super well for being locked down in a global pandemic, because you will spend lots of time all by yourself reading. You will experience an enormous amount of apathy from people you're trying to connect to, and you will have rejection after rejection. And so you will become much more resilient. It's also helpful for that.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for coming. This has been great. And I knew it would be great, and you didn't disappoint. And all that remains is for me to point out that in our salad days, we would have thanked you by giving each of you this AGS t-shirt, right? You can see that. And, you know, if you saw someone wearing this in a job interview, that's an automatic hire. But now, because of fiscal constraints, we're only giving the three of you one of these, which you will rotate, and you'll wear 1 week at a time. And we'll have to just make that do until the funding situation improves. But in the meantime, I can thank you, and I really mean to thank you so much for all you did. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It was a great education for me to hear Kelly and Kath's advice.
Same.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.